The article in last Friday's New York Times was startling. The headline read, "A city where wild boars enjoy the life of the boulevardier." The article went on to read, "The boars snooze in people's paddling pools. They snuffle across the lawns. They kick residents' soccer balls and play with their dogs. They saunter down the sidewalks and sleep in the streets. Some eat from the hands of humans, and they all eat from the trash." Now, you might assume this was some quaint town in Provence, or a small village nestled in the English countryside. Rather, it was the Mediterranean city of Haifa in Israel. The boars, it seems, are not so wild. While some residents of Haifa complain of the damage done to their lawns, others are leaving food out for them. It really wasn't the story of boars overrunning a city that was so startling. What was startling was to read a story about Israel that was not political. Nothing about Bibi or Iran or the Israel Prize. It was nothing less than delightful to read an article about Israel that focused on one of the many quirky characteristics that make Israel, well, Israel. Just a slice of life. If you have been to Israel, or even if you're familiar with Israel, you know what I'm talking about. Like asking an Israeli for directions. First, they yell at you, even though you're a tourist, for not knowing how to get to your destination. Then, they insist on taking you there to make sure you do not get lost. If you follow stories in the media about Israel, you know just about everything written or said about Israel is politicized. It is so rare to read a story about Israel that is just about Israel. Some defend everything Israel does, or at least justify its actions. Others are critical, seizing on every decision of the government as yet another example of Israel's inability to live up to its prophetic promise. It can be a challenge not to be swayed by so much polarized reporting on Israel. The real challenge for many of us is separating the government of Israel from the land of Israel. We do not have to agree with everything the Israeli government does. Perhaps the real reason we so often find ourselves critical of Israel, frustrated and exasperated by its government's decisions, is because it holds such an important place in our hearts, if not our lives. And yet, as Rabbi Eric Yaffe pointed out in a recent opinion piece in Haaretz, despite everything, ties between American Jews and their Israeli cousins remain remarkably strong. One recent survey of American Jewry found that 80% of American Jews consider themselves pro-Israel, and 67% feel an emotional attachment to Israel. Rabbi Yaffe goes on to say, "We may not agree with Israel very much in this seemingly endless Netanyahu era, but we are obsessed with it nonetheless. We worry about its welfare and security." We continue to be mesmerized by its story, and by extension, our own story. Out of the ashes of the Holocaust, pioneers, many still feeling the effects of the Second World War, made the desert bloom, created the most democratic nation in the Middle East, gave us one of the first national leaders who was a woman, and inventions from the first USB drive to drip irrigation. If you want a modern-day miracle, you need only look as far as Israel, a nation that is leading the world in vaccinating its population. We may never love the government of Israel, but we can love the land of Israel. And there is plenty to love. Art and music, from the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra to the Bat Sheva Dance Company. Cucumbers for breakfast and corn on your pizza. A pride celebration in Tel Aviv that attracts visitors from around the globe. Sirens across Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon announcing the arrival of Shabbat. To just about every expression of Jewish life, including over 40 Reform congregations. To that prickly Israeli cab driver who expects you to sit in the front seat with him and have a conversation on the way to your destination, even though you only speak a few words of Hebrew and he only a few words of English. And while Israel has the dubious distinction of holding 4 national elections in just 2 years, there is one positive election result to report. Rabbi Gilad Kariv, executive director of the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, has become the first Reform rabbi elected to the Knesset. Of course, it is not that simple. With every mention of Israel, we wish to be able to puff out our chest and hold our head up high. We want, even demand, that Israel be a light unto the nations. But we cannot let our disappointment dampen our affection. Though our own United States has yet to live up to many of its founding principles, we are not packing our bags. And so it is with Israel, a young country and certainly a work in progress. While we can and should be critical when warranted, we must be wary of joining the chorus of others who hold Israel, and often only Israel, to a standard not expected of other nations. There are no shortage of things we can do to foster the Israel we dream of, from supporting the Israeli causes in which we believe, to educating ourselves about modern Israel. One way to begin educating ourselves is by moderating what we read and hear about Israel. It may take a bit of extra work, but we can seek out information about Israel that is not only political but cultural, from a burgeoning food scene to the latest Israeli music, to binge-watching shtisel on Netflix, from Israel as a startup nation to the 9 cultural World Heritage sites it has. We can create a deeper connection to Israel and to her people. Speaking of her people, in Rabbi Yafi's article, he went on to say that according to the 2021 World Happiness Report, Israel ranks 12 out of 149 countries. The United States ranks 19. Rabbi Yafi writes, Israel has always performed impressively in this study. What is remarkable is that it continues to do so, despite a year of COVID lockdowns, political instability, and election after election. The politicians are constantly battling each other, of course, but regular Israelis are not doing so badly. As we celebrate Israel's 73rd birthday, most of us cannot imagine a world without Israel, nor would we want to. We don't have to love Israel's politics, but we can love the people and its culture. And don't forget about the not-so-wild boars of Haifa.